There's a story in Luke chapter 8, towards the end of the chapter, that we often read and we don't really see the depth of it. Jesus is out on the road somewhere, and a synagogue official, which would be kind of like a pastoral staff member in a church, even though synagogues weren't really churches, they were usually ruled and run and managed by religious people. This synagogue official comes up to him and says, "Please, would you come with me? My 12-year-old daughter is on the verge of death." And Jesus looks at him and says, okay. And there it tells a story how he gets distracted by another woman, and he ends up doing some miracles right there. And while this is happening, some of the people from the synagogue official's home show up, and they tell the synagogue official, "It's too late. Your daughter's died. Don't bother him anymore." Jesus, while he's being distracted, happens to overhear the conversation. He turns to the synagogue official and says, No, only believe. Now that's an interesting statement, because that's what the synagogue official was supposed to be doing, believing in God. Well, it's interesting because sometimes what we project as who we are isn't what we really do. So Jesus says, "Let's go." And they go to the synagogue official's house. And when they arrive there, they find the typical crowd of mourners and grievers outside the house, chanting and praying and making the loud, sorrowful groans that they did. It was their tradition of how to show love and respect for a family when there was a death in it. This was not uncommon. This is the way they did it in their culture. Jesus walks in the midst of this crowd and he says, "I don't know what's going on, but she isn't dead. She's just sleeping." And they look at him, and the scriptures are kind of light in the language, but when you read it in its original language, it says they started making fun of him. They're laughing at him, saying, "You don't know what you're talking about. She's dead." And these people knew what someone looked like when they were dead. Well, Jesus steps through the crowd, and he grabs the mother and father, and he grabs his 3 apostles who he has put a lot of effort into. We call them the inner circle apostles, Peter, James, and John, and nobody else. He forbids anybody else from going into the house. And he goes in. They are the only 5 people in the house with him. It's interesting because 5 typically in the Old Testament and the New Testament is a number that represents pure ministry. Jesus goes over to the girl's bed, sits down beside her, and she's obviously motionless and in all aspects appears to be physically, mortally dead. He grabs her hand and he says, "Little girl, arise." And she sits up and she starts walking around the room. Wow. Jesus looks at the parents and he says, "Don't make a big deal out of this. Don't go around and telling everybody about all this. It's okay. She's alive. You need to know what the source of that is." We are reading into it a little bit because Jesus did this privately. Jesus was showing his apostles and this mother and father where the source of real life was. Yes, he raised her from the dead. That's not what the story is really about. The story is about the power of God and the love that he has for us, and that he is the source of our life. And all Jesus had to do was say, "Arise." If we believe, we can hear Jesus still saying that today. Well, this isn't what would typically happen today. If this would have been the situation in a televangelist today, or even most pastors, they would have said, "Get out your cell phones, record this, bring the cameras in close, we're going to have a miracle." And they would have put the show on, and they would have made it look miraculous, and they would have received a lot of accolades and glory because they raised someone from the dead. Jesus wasn't in it for that. He didn't need the accolades. He didn't need the applause nor the glory. He wanted to show people where the source of life is. And that true life comes from the Creator and Giver and the Sacrificer of life.